Hey everyone, Kevin P. McAuliffe here, and I am back again with another Let's Edit with Avid Media Composer tutorial. And in this lesson, believe it or not, we're actually going to talk about exporting. Now you're probably thinking, Kev, that's crazy. How are we talking about exporting already? We're only like 11 or 12 lessons in. Well, what's important to keep in mind is that what I want you to understand is how to be able to get footage into Media Composer correctly, how to be able to get it into a timeline, and how to export it from Media Composer, because everything else I show you other than those three concepts is really just icing on the cake. All right. What we're going to be doing after we talk about exporting is really getting in and having some fun with all kinds of different concepts inside of Media Composer. But it's important to understand now how to export your timeline from Media Composer so that you can take it, send it to a client, you can take it and stream it for YouTube, whatever you might need to do with it. When you're done this lesson, you should have no problem doing that, so we can move forward after it by getting into some bigger and bigger concepts. All right, now, as always, before we get rolling, I want to give a big shout out and a big thanks to our sponsor, Video Guys. Don't forget, you can find links in the show notes below so that you can get on over to their website, get your Media Composer subscription. Use that discount code of MC101 to get 5% off your Media Composer license purchase. I love Video Guys. I love their team. I love the support they give. And of course, you can't go wrong getting that 5% off as well. I also want to remind you that if you or your team are looking for private one-on-one Media Composer training, don't hesitate to send me an email at kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com. I tailor all of the training for what your team's needs are, for what your needs are. We get all the questions you want answered to your satisfaction so that you can get the most out of your Media Composer editing experience. So you can always send me that email at kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com for more details. And last but certainly not least, I want to remind you that if you like these tutorials, please don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share these videos across social media. We really want to get the word out there about Media Composer for any editor that might need to jump in, whether they're a new editor to the industry or whether they're a seasoned editor that just needs to jump into Media Composer and get work done. I hope these tutorials will help them, and you can help get the word out there by sharing them across your social media channels. All right, I think that's enough for the introduction. Let's just get into Media Composer and let's get rolling. All right, so let's Command or Alt and Tab into Avid Media Composer. Now, what's important to keep in mind is that everything that we talk about in this lesson is going to work exactly the same for Mac and Windows. So don't think that just because I'm doing this tutorial on a Windows machine that anything is going to function any differently if you work on a Mac. Now, I do have the timeline that we had here from our previous lesson, which is what we're going to use in the example of exporting. Now, exporting can come in many different fashions. You could be exporting a clip that a client needs to have sent to them so they can review it. You could be wanting to export a still frame from Avid Media Composer. You could be wanting to export just the audio tracks. You could be wanting to export an actual Pro Tools session or AAF session to send to Post Audio or to send to DaVinci Resolve to do work. Now, we're going to focus on those last two in a future lesson, because in this lesson, I just want to tackle common exports that you're going to do from Media Composer based on what you are asked for from the client. Now, let's start out with the most common one. We have our timeline here. The client would like to have it sent to them for them to review. So how do we go about doing this? Well, there are two schools of thought when it comes to exporting from Avid Media Composer. All right, let's say hypothetically that the client just wants a standard H.264, either MP4 or .mov file. They want to take that file and they want to use that as their visual reference. All right, now for me personally, I am not a big fan of attempting to export as MP4s or, pardon me, as H.264 MP4s or H.264.movs from Media Composer. I find the process to be a very long export process. I mean, granted, we are only dealing with a timeline here that's about 10 seconds long, but once you're getting into longer timelines, 10 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, what my normal export method is to export a master file and then use another application like Adobe's Media Encoder to then flip that file over to send to the client. I find it just to be a much faster way to export from Media Composer and flip it over to the exact type of file that I want to send to the client. I'm going to show you both methods inside of Media Composer so you are aware of how to do it, but my general workflow is export a master file and flip it over outside of Media Composer. Don't be trying to export as a ProRes file from Media Composer. Don't be trying to export as an H.264 file from Media Composer, because I find the process just to be exceptionally long. All right, so let's just start out by exporting this as a master clip from Media Composer. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave everything the way that it is. I'm not going to add any marks in my timeline, in-out points, nothing like that. I'm going to assume that we want to export the entire timeline. All right, so to do this, we can set this up one of a couple ways. So let's talk about just getting in and doing the export method. To do this, it's quite simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate right over here to the Composer window to the record side or the sequence side, and I'm simply going to right click, and what I'm going to do is navigate down to export. Now there's a couple ways you can do this. You can do it the way I just did it there. You can navigate over to the timeline here and simply right click and navigate to output. And what you want to do is to export to file, or you can navigate up here to file, come down to output and select export to file. Now keep in mind, if it's something you do on a very regular basis, you can always map this as a keyboard shortcut as well. But what I'm going to do is simply say export to file. Now you'll notice down here I have an export setting called untitled. You'll notice if I drop that down, untitled is the only choice I have. Now what this is that it's the base default Media Composer output setting, which I don't even know what it is right now. But what it's designed to do is it's designed for me to start setting up presets for me to work with moving forward. Let me show you what I mean. The first thing that I obviously need to do is to figure out what Media Composer is doing. What is it asking me? How do I want to output this file? What I'm going to do is navigate right over here to my options. I'm going to click on options, and now you'll see that right now I'm set up to export as an AAF file, which I don't want to do. What I'm going to do is just click on the drop down here and take a look at all of the different options I have here from, believe it or not, again, this is a Windows only thing here, AVI, Windows Media, Audio, Graphic, SCC, you can see Avid Log Exchange, a whole bunch of different options in here. Now for this lesson, we're really going to focus on three of them. I'm going to focus on MXF OP1A, I'm going to focus on MOV and MP4. Now, to be honest, these two really sort of go hand in hand, and you'll see what I mean by that in just a minute, but let's focus on exporting a master from Avid Media Composer. So for me to export a master, what I'm simply going to do is navigate up to MXF OP1A. Now you'll notice that as soon as I do that, the export window changes. You'll see it says AMA file export, and now I can choose what video compression I want to output as. Now, I'm calling this a master file, and I'm using that in air quotes, because what I'm assuming is that you want to export a file that is good quality that you can take and then compress to whatever file, size limit you need to compress it to out of Media Composer. And the beauty part about using MXF OP1A is it gives you a whole bunch of different video compressions. Now, depending on your workflow, you'll see certain options in here that you might not see depending on how you have your project set up. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to focus on these ones right here, DNX HD down to DNX HR. Now, keep in mind, you can export as a ProRes, but that is an MXF ProRes file, not a ProRes.mov, but don't worry. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So what I'm going to do is just focus on these ones. Now, because I have a 1920 by 1080 timeline, Media Composer knows that I will have the DNX HD option as well. But let's actually just remove that for now. Since we're sort of moving, we're trying to stay current with the technologies, the codecs, etc., etc. So we're just going to choose DNX HR. Now, what you can normally do is work by process of elimination. All right. Well, I'm not really going to focus on 444 as far as my export goes. This was actually brought in at super low res. So for me, what my biggest concern is just keeping the quality good and not recompressing it at a lower quality when I export it so that we don't see any artifacting or anything like that. So what I normally like to do when I export a quote unquote master is I'll use a DNX HR high quality or standard quality when I'm exporting. Now, what's important to keep in mind is, let's just say your audio house needed a low-res reference file. No problem. I would use DNX HR low bandwidth in that case. But like I said, because we're focusing on a master level quality, it's HQ or SQ. All right, so I'm just going to choose HQ for right now. Now, you'll notice There really are no other options in here, which is what I love about this export workflow. It's really choose the video compression. What do you want your audio to be? And in our case, I want it to be stereo. Now, you'll remember in our previous lesson when we talked about audio, I said that everything working in a dual mono fashion here with all the odd channels being left and the even channels being right, Media Composer will simply fold all of those tracks down, all of the odd channels and even channels, to be stereo left and stereo right. Now what I'm going to do is instead of saying save, I'm going to come over here and call this a save as, or do a save as. Now what we're going to do here is, just for the purposes of this, instead of me calling it mastering, because that's normally what I call my mastering output, I'm actually going to call it exactly what it is, DNXHR HQ stereo. All right. Now I should add something else in there, but I'm not going to do that, and you'll see why in just a second. What I'm going to do is simply say OK, and now you'll see that not only does that export preset appear here, but .mxf appears after the name of our clip. All I now need to do is to simply say save. In a few seconds, you'll see that that will appear here on my desktop. And if I double click on it, you'll now see that we have that full resolution video file. What I should do is just cut that size down to be half. By the way, I love that music. It's like totally awesome. Okay. But you see, we now have a master quality file exported to our desktop, ready to go. Now, what is important to keep in mind about what I just did is that the way that I set things up is I set it up to export the entire timeline. I set it to export all of the audio tracks. I didn't say I only want to export a certain range of the timeline, or I only want to export certain tracks, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an alternate export preset that's going to do that for me. Let me show you what I mean. Now I could come in and I could come here and I could right click and I could go to export again and I could go to the preset and I could set it up. But what I'm going to do is not do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my settings. And in my settings, you'll now see that if I come down to export, well, look at that. I now have an export preset called DNXHR HQ stereo. Now what I should have just done is come over here and added in full timeline, like such. Because this way I now know that if I select this export preset, it's going to export from the beginning to the end, all tracks. So what I can now do is, instead of having to go through the whole export process again to create a new preset, I'm actually just going to delete this one that was the original untitled one. And what I'm now going to do is I'm going to come to this export preset and I'm simply going to right click and I'm going to come down to duplicate. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call this I/O. All right, and what I'm now going to do is double click, and in here you'll see the exact same export preset, but what I'm going to do is to select use marks and use selected tracks. What that tells Media Composer is that if I come in here and I mark an in and out point and I only select video and audio 1 and audio 2, only export that range and those tracks. All right, so you can see how you can easily get in and take one preset, one export preset, and modify it very quickly and easily to do a different function. Same codec, same everything when it exports. Now it's just going to select a certain range, which is obviously helpful if you're working on a whole show. You only need to export one segment. This is how you can go in and do that. Now again, if we wanted to create a brand new export preset, let's use that H.264 export as an example. What I'm now going to do is I'm simply going to come to this export preset. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say duplicate. And what I'm going to do is give it a completely different name. I'm going to call it H.264 MP4. Now I'm not going to show you the MOV version of this because it's essentially exactly the same. But what I'm now going to do is double click on that export preset. Now what I probably should have done before that is I probably should have stuck with my full timeline or I/O. So I'm just going to call this full timeline. So that way when we come back in, I'm going to double click. We'll just deselect, use marks, and use selected tracks. And I'm going to drop this down and I'm going to come down to MP4. Now you'll notice that when I do that, we now have a whole bunch of new options in here. And what I want to do is just draw your attention, all right, to the fact that the MP4 and the MOV export is essentially identical. Keep in mind, MP4.MOV, they are both containers. They're not the actual codec. The actual codec what we're going to be using is H.264, but you'll notice we have a few options in here. Again, what I'm going to do is come back to MP4, and I believe I had said to do the full timeline. So let's just deselect use marks and use selected tracks. You'll see, very first option, what do you want to do? Project raster, 1920 by 1080, yes. So this is good, good, good. I don't need to worry about source scaling because all of my clips in my timeline are actually already 1920 by 1080. I want to keep the frame rate the same way it is, keep the color space the way that it is, but here's where things get interesting. I'm going to come right down here. You'll notice that I can now choose what compressor I want to use to export this file. Now you'll notice that DNxHR was an option. This is how you can get in and export DNxHR.mov files, QuickTime files. Now, for the purposes of what we're doing, we now consider a master to be an MXF file, so I will not be exporting any .mov files. If I needed to make a ProRes.mov file, I would do that inside of Adobe Media Encoder. What I'm going to do here with the codec family is simply drop that down, and I'm going to come down. You'll see we have a few options in here. AVC Intra, AVC Long-Op, the DNx HDNR. For me, I would like H.264. You'll see there's our compression type, the color depth. We can even choose our bit rate, constant or variable single pass. I'm going to set the target bit rate to be about, I don't know, let's go with something like, 12. The max will be something like, let's make sure, good. I'm not sure why that's not coming up. That could be a little bug there. Let's just set 18 to be the full. And what I should have done here is not hit enter. Let's just come back in here. Perfect. Let's come down. Let's just double check. Perfect. 12, 18. Choose the audio. Again, in our case, we want it to be stereo. And what I'm now going to do is simply come up here. Let's just bring the window up here. You'll see there's our Universal Media Engine. And I'm just going to say OK. Now let's just double check here that it's the full timeline. Perfect. Use marks. Use selected tracks. Not selected. Everything else in here, though, is pretty much good to go for an H.264.mp4 file. So all I'm going to do is say OK. I'm going to duplicate this. Why? Because, of course, we need to make sure that we have an I/O as well. All right, double click. All I'm going to do in here is simply change use marks and use selected tracks. The beauty part about now is that what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to select the export preset that I want to use right here from within my settings. So what's going to happen is that when I right click and I come down to export, you'll see it's actually already selected and ready to go right here in my export settings. I don't need to look because I already set it up. All I'm going to do is simply say save. You'll see that actually wasn't too bad as far as exporting goes. And you'll see it here on my desktop. I can double click. There it is again as an H.264 MP4 file. There we go, all set. Looking pretty good. Very nice. Now, again, I just want to circle back and talk a little bit about the whole master file export versus, coming in and exporting directly as an H.264 file. I'm also a little bit paranoid about things, and I like to try to only do things once. When I get into situations where I'm ready to show something to a client, I always like to export one master. The reason being is they may come back and say, oh, can you do me a favor? Can you make a YouTube version of it for this? Can you make one version that's a 640 by 360 version to send to this? Can you do this and make me 15 versions of it? I would rather make all of those 15 versions inside a Media Encoder in a few presets than having to come into Media Composer and just be exporting timelines one after the other. So that's why I always say, try not to get into exporting H.264 and MOVs or MP4s from Media Composer. Export one master file and use that to make all of your copies from. All right. Now, a couple other presets that I like to get in and create as well. Let's just come back into Media Composer. I'm going to duplicate again. I'm going to call this simply Wave Export. Actually, let's call it Wave Full. What I should have done is called it Full Timeline. Now, I did notice here that I did call this Full I/O, which I should have just called this Stereo I/O. That's Full Timeline. This should have been Stereo Timeline. But the beauty part is you see that you can actually, Stereo I/O, that's fine. Full Timeline should have been Stereo Full Timeline. There we go. But you'll see that this is actually a much easier way than doing it from the export window, doing everything here. Again, I'm simply going to take my Wave Full Timeline, double click. Let's come here. It's not called Wave. It's actually called Audio. And I'll make sure it's stereo, audio. You'll see I can come down. I leave the sample and the bit depths to be the project, and the audio format is WAV. Now keep in mind it can be WAV or AIFFC. If for some reason all my Mac friends out there would like AIFFC, you can use that as well. But what I'm now going to do, again, much like I had done before, is make sure that I have the use marks and use selected tracks not set. I'm going to say OK. And I could duplicate this again, but I'm not going to do that because I'm just going to show you one last one. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of an alternate as well. All right. The last one, of course, is exporting a still frame. How many times have you had clients come and say, can you send me a still frame of this? Send me a still frame of that. No problem. We can do that. Again, right click, duplicate. What I'm going to do is call this JPEG. And what I'm going to do with my export here is I'm going to come to still image, or pardon me, graphic. You'll see we can get in here. I'm going to come to JPEG. You'll see the size is going to be 1920 by 1080. You can choose the color levels, keep as legal range, scale from legal to full range. What I normally do is I'm just going to, by force of habit, say use marks and use selected tracks, because normally I just like to mark an endpoint. It's just a habit I have. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. But all I'm going to do now is simply say OK. Now keep in mind, if for some reason a client wanted a JPEG sequence or a PNG sequence, this is where you could come in and set that as well. Now, with that being said, there's something exceptionally important I need to talk about exporting still images from Media Composer. You will notice if I come over to JPEG and I come to Format Options, you'll see we don't really have any options in here other than the quality and whether it's baseline or progressive. All right, and what I'm going to do is simply say, OK, I'll leave that as an export. I'm just going to come down. I'm going to select this shot right here. I'm going to come to export. You'll see there it is right there. I'm going to save it onto my desktop. And you'll see that we got a pretty good still frame. Now, couple things. There's my still frame. Couple things that I want to point out. Unless the client needs it to be 1920 by 1080, what I normally tell all of my Windows friends is to simply use the snipping tool to send any images that you might need from your timeline for approval. For example, here, if the client said, can you show me what our talent does when she pops her head out? I say, no problem. I come in here, I use the snipping tool, I grab the little range, I take this that I've now created, and I copy it and paste it into an email to send to the client. Now for all of my Mac friends, I simply use Command Shift and 4 to take a snapshot of an area. I snapshot the area, I take that, I copy, I paste it into an email, and I send it off. I don't go through the whole export, JPEG, take it, add it to an email. This is much faster and much better way to do it. Now, obviously, they want it to be 1920 by 1080. Different story. You can go about doing that. However, here's the most important part of this process. Television's DPI is 72 DPI. You will have many, and I cannot stress how many there are, clients who will say, can you export something for me to use in a print ad? And your answer will always be the same. No, I cannot. Print quality is 300 DPI. I cannot export a 300 DPI clip out of Media Composer for you to use in a print ad. I am limited to 72 DPI out of Media Composer. You can obviously take that, use it however you like, but that's something that's exceptionally important that you tell every client when they ask. Unfortunately, I cannot export anything larger than 72 DPI outside of Media Composer. So what you'll see now is that we've built a fairly good little export preset list for all kinds of different export presets we might need to use from Media Composer. So what this has now done is it's rounded out sort of the core basic lessons inside of Media Composer that are very important. I've now shown you how to get footage into Media Composer, how to easily drop it into a timeline, and how to export it from Media Composer for you to either take, get it ready for YouTube, send to a client, or do whatever you need to do with it. So now moving forward, we're going to have some real fun, and all the lessons we're going to talk about are all the extra bells and whistles that go along with everything from bins to titling to editing in your timeline to mixing audio and everything else in between, so that you really know where the tools are for the first part. But for the most part, it's actually getting in and understanding why Media Composer does what it does, why it works the way that it works, and how you can get the most out of your Media Composer editing experience every time you sit at the desk. All right, so as always, I want to give a big shout out and a big thanks to our sponsor, Video Guys. Don't forget, check out those links in the show notes so that you can get 5% off of your Media Composer subscription using that coupon code of MC101. And as always, I want to remind you that if you like this tutorial, if you found it useful, please hit that like, subscribe, and share this tutorial across social media. Help us get the word out there about Avid Media Composer and this training series that we're following along with. And as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send them to me at kevinpmcauliffe@gmail.com. Thanks a lot for watching.